This is the journey to one Africa.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I'd like to extend my warm congratulations to you on your election to the presidency of this 78th Ordinary Session of the General Assembly. I further pay tribute to your predecessor, Mr. Xaba Korozi, for his work during his term. And I'd like to express the confidence of my country to the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his bold and multiform action to implement reforms, to achieve and accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals on the one hand, and to promote international peace and security. Mr. President, I stand before this august assembly in an unprecedented context for my country which has emerged from trials and tribulations following a chaotic electoral process which was interrupted on 30 August by the security and defense forces. This intervention was, of course, condemned by the international community as a violation of the democratic requirements for the handover of power. It would, however, be useful to provide a balance of information and to allay some suspicions. It would be useful to recall specifically what the Gabonese political context was which preceded this takeover of power and justified it. It would be a mistake from our point of view to hand down judgments or to lump things together and not take into account the reality of our context. If I may, first and foremost, I'd like to recall for everyone here the experience of the 2016 presidential election. And the current situation is a result of that election. Everyone will recall that election was reported on by the electoral mission of the European Union, which looked at the circumstances around it and denounced it as a fraudulent process, one that was insincere and stripped of any transparency, with results that challenged the very laws of statistics. It was characterized especially by violence, the loss of human life in significant numbers, and damage to goods for all. In order to mitigate the situation, the social cost of which was quite high, in 2017, a dialogue was organized, which ended up in a return to elections twice. This small concession to democracy, which was once again postponed to 2013 before it could even take place. So the regime had no intention of renouncing its fraudulent strategy. Between 2017 and 2022, there were no preparations made for the elections that were supposed to be held according to the Constitution at the very latest on the 26th of August 2023. The preparations only started in February of 2023 and led to an unimaginable number of twists and distortions in the constitutional framework, the legislative and regulatory framework for the elections, including when the election process had already been launched. I could mention just a couple of examples in a non-exhaustive list of them. Let me start with the return to one round of elections. The choice of a president of the Gabonese Election Center, which was notoriously partial as a member of known to the party in power. The absence of reliability of the electoral lists, which had people on it that were known to be deceased. The suppression of provisions that allowed for the representation of candidates in several different locations with a flagrant violation of the principle of equality, modification in the violation of the simple principle of the hierarchy of norms and legislative provisions as part of the laws set forth for elections, and the merging of candidates for presidential and legislative elections. We can see that these modifications were rejected without any review by a constitutional court when the people appealed for justice. Any observer who is attentive, honest, and in good faith of Gabonese political life in recent years would be fully aware of the unraveling of the situation. Everyone within the Gabonese opposition sought out diplomatic missions on the ground in August, and then on the 9th of August 2023 went to the special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Africa, Central Africa, residing in Libreville, to try to alert him to the shape of things in the electoral process and the danger of maintaining the state of affairs. And I need to state this here without any ambiguity. Neither the political actors nor the voters themselves, no one was prepared to accept, once again, electoral misconduct. This determination, which was known to all, did not prevent the Gabonese Center for Elections from sending urns under its exclusive control and that were not sealed, and then to proceed to fraudulent records of the elections and the results. And the results obtained in this manner could only lead to, after they were announced, clashes. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, given the situation, the Defense and Security Forces had a choice. They could either prepare to repress the protests, running the risk that sooner or later they would be persecuted in international courts for their responsibility, or they could choose to decide to interrupt a fraudulent and dangerous electoral process, one that was dangerous to national cohesion. They chose the second option in order to put an end to the risk of a fire which would have engulfed the very foundation of Gabonese society, and that would have not have spared the many foreign people living in Gabon. They chose what was responsible. They chose the second option to stop the possibility of a fire which, as I said before, would have completely overwhelmed Gabonese society. It would not have been reasonable or responsible to allow such a situation to continue. The ensuing cycle of violence would have led to overwhelming disaster. As a result, this military intervention, without any bloodshed, without any material damage, was seen as the lesser of two evils. And the people approved it with a very large majority, as reflected by the spontaneous outbreaks of jubilation that were seen in images broadcast around the world, and whereby the majority of the political class was actually relieved to have avoided an uncertain outcome. Henceforth, to condemn such a process would be to support the idea that it would have been better to allow the clashes and conflict to take place and then to be counting the number of victims afterwards, since no one in the opposition, no one was prepared to allow this election to be hijacked once again. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, while this intervention was necessary, we could not be satisfied with allowing the status quo to prevail. Without any delay, in an inclusive manner, we need to prepare reform and return to an ordinary institutional process that would allow for the handing over of power through elections. The transition government's roadmap, transition government that I have been leading for the last 2 weeks, is geared to restoring confidence and to making major correction to the electoral framework and to restore institutions and prepare them for implementing these reforms. The expected deliverables will come following national conferences, adoption of a new constitution that reflects our social contract, and enacting laws that include legislative elections that lead to free, transparent, and credible elections. And that's why already next week we have planned a press conference where I will at that time indicate the timeline for consultations with the political class as a whole and civil society. And I will take that opportunity to outline the program and schedule of the various stages that will lead to new elections. And from this point of view, what Gabon needs most is encouragement and accompaniment to accomplish these tasks in a timeline that everyone sees as reasonable. And I take this opportunity then to launch a solemn appeal to all of our bilateral, regional, and multilateral partners to accompany us and support the people's desire for national health with a view to strengthening the rule of law and democracy for shared prosperity. At this turning point in our destiny and in our history, the Gabonese people are united in its support for the Committee for Transition and Restoration of Institution, and will remember with appreciation the solidarity and the trust of the peoples of Africa and around the world who stand at their side in order to preserve our place in the concert of nations.
Monsieur le Président,
President, 78 years after the UN was created, an endless cycle of crises continues to cloud aspirations and darken the horizon for sustainable peace between and within nations. The multiple crises of solidarity, security crises, humanitarian crises, health crises, climate crises, geopolitical crises fuel sentiments of mistrust vis-à-vis international institutions and mechanisms. Indeed, the system of collective and indivisible security advocated for by the United Nations Charter patently appears as fiction in numerous regions of the world, prey to the upheavals of war, particularly in Africa and the region of Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the region of the Great Lakes. They have become true epicenters of instability. In the majority of these regions, predation for natural resources is a significant source of conflict, to a point where these resources become a real curse for the countries that possess them. President, today we are at an inflection point which requires each and every member of the international community to take ownership once again of the objectives of the UN Charter. And it requires that they reconcile a reconciliation with the aspirations of peoples of the world. It is crucial to reframe the social contract between nations, whatever their size or population, and bearing in mind that every people counts. We must, above all, recalibrate how we project our identity as peoples of the world, prioritizing dialogue each and every time over fighting, prioritizing cooperation over the spirit of us versus them. We must, without further ado, carry out a real structural transformation of the peace and security architecture of our organization and adapt mechanisms for promoting peace and security to a global context marked by ever-changing crises and conflicts. This is why the theme of this session is so relevant. It is focused on the need to rebuild confidence and to reignite solidarity, to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. President, Gabon reaffirms that prevention is a tool that is more than essential. It must be at the heart of our actions if we wish to see consolidated and lasting peace. The efforts of the international community in terms of prevention have so far been slow, ill-adapted and underfunded. Indeed, the absence of sufficient resources for the work of our organization for prevention and peace building has alas contributed to a resurgence of crises during transitions, or it has given rise to new conflicts. Our generation has a responsibility towards future generations to leave them a world that is safer, a world where the threats to peace and security linked to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction has been curbed. We should leave them a world without a nuclear threat. President, there is still a considerable gap between our actions and our commitments. It is time to bridge this gap, particularly on the crucial issue of financing climate action. Gabon has invested for decades on the preservation of biodiversity and has shown constant commitment to the fight against climate change. New financial debt for nature compacts provide opportunities to increase budgets allocated to protect biodiversity and to respond to the unsustainable debt of developing countries and to fight climate change. Through this new green financing mechanism, my country has just benefited from a restructuration of 3% of its debt in return for a commitment to invest $163 million to preserve our marine ecosystems. We must go further in this vein. I invite, therefore, international financial partners to increase the numbers of initiatives to convert debt so that we can address the challenges of global warming, the loss of biodiversity and sustainable development. It's through a multilateral approach and by reviewing how we respond to these challenges that we'll be able to effectively address the multiform challenges that are standing before humanity. President, the Agenda 2030 is our shared roadmap to address global challenges. However, with less than 10 years to go, progress is unequal and insufficient. Poverty, hunger, social inequality, shortcomings in terms of health and education, lack of sufficient funding for the SDGs, all of this is seriously jeopardizing the implementation of this ambitious agenda. Throughout the transition period that I'm leading, I plan on redoubling my country's efforts to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda through strengthening in a practical and pragmatic way our national policies, and also through encouraging public-private partnerships that are innovative. Also, I intend to focus on local action carried out by authorities, civil society and the private sector, fully involving citizens, particularly young people and women. It is crucial that the international community be able to increase its support to developing countries. Further funding is indeed necessary, particularly for the most vulnerable countries. The various different summits that have been organised in the sidelines of this session, particularly on financing for development, climate ambition, universal health coverage, are all an opportunity for the international community to translate goodwill into joint action and to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. President, within the United Nations system, exclusion and marginalisation loom large over our efforts to coexist. Africa must be able to find its rightful place as a fully fledged actor on the international stage and not simply a stake for the world's powers. Indeed, more than 78 years after the creation of the UN, the world has completely changed. The international context has completely changed. The geopolitical landscape has completely changed. The nature of wars has literally been transformed. Technology has completely revolutionized our day-to-day lives, but the structure of our institutions essentially remains unchanged, particularly in terms of our collective security. To address the challenges of the future, our security architecture must reflect current and future realities. We must update our international institutions as well as our mentalities, how we envisage lasting peace, shared prosperity and coexistence. We must reinvent solutions to contemporary threats, particularly climate change and cyber insecurity. We must, when faced with a crisis of international solidarity, which is fueling adjacent crises on the economic, humanitarian, health or food fronts, we cannot address these challenges of this century with the tools from the last one. President, in the light of these stark facts, we are convinced of the need to act, to implement 3 fundamental axes that are able to make the multilateral system more credible and more inclusive. Firstly, we must reform the Security Council without further ado. It must represent today's reality and the current and future challenges we face. Secondly, we must also redefine our rules and our mechanisms so that we can address how insecurity and terrorism are evolving. It's a question of guaranteeing inclusivity and solidarity, so that there is no more room for double standards. We must also more concertedly attack the root causes of conflicts and crises. Thirdly, We must build a new social contract, a new global compact between generations, between those who govern and those who are governed, between the global and the regional, with a focus particularly on young people, women, civil society, and the private sector. In this new social contract for the future, bridges must always replace walls. Education must always loosen the stranglehold of ignorance and intolerance. Multilateralism must prevail over unilateral stances, and a logic of dialogue must always prevail over the logic of antagonism and jockeying for influence. President, to conclude, I wish to underscore our demand to respond to present and future generations. This intergenerational solidarity is a moral obligation vis-à-vis those who will have no choice but to inherit the consequences of the choices we make today. We owe them a response that assuages their fears, meets their needs and their legitimate aspirations to live in peace, in dignity and prosperity. It's with these existential questions in mind that we have shouldered our responsibilities, and that we have resolutely committed to put our action in line with the expectations of our peoples. Thank you very much.